Hi YouTube. Recently I uploaded a video where I was responding to a request by Matthew Steele to answer a question, what is the worst possible moral act? And I think it's an interesting question. There have certainly been some interesting comments going back and forth and a couple of interesting response videos. I've seen the one by Evidence and Negation of P. There may be others I haven't seen yet. And also a comment by Ozzy left on Matthew Steele's original video request. Brascofarian had left a comment on my video saying that it's kind of an incoherent question because it's highly context specific. And I completely understand that. The reason that I chose to make a video response is because I think I understand the intent behind Matthew Steele's question, and that is to spark some conversation about secular morality. And I'm always keen to do that. I find the topic very interesting. I've got a lot of curiosity about how we arrive at a secular morality. Is there a potential for an objective set of secular ethics, or is it all subjective? If it's all subjective and context specific, in other words, always related to your particular goals, how do we normalize the goals within a society, etc., etc.? And so it's obviously a very important topic as well, especially as societies become more and more secular. These are things that we need to discuss. So I think the conversation is very important. Getting back to context specific, I find it interesting that I had a choice when I saw Matthew Steele's original request to either be very cerebral and think and think and think and try to outdo myself and outdo everybody else and come up with the worst possible moral act, or I could just make a knee-jerk response video, sort of like they asked Ward Churchill, you know, give us your knee-jerk response, write an essay on 9/11 like on 9/12, and tell us, you know, all your feelings so we can have a snapshot of that, what happened that day. I should be careful about equating what I'm doing with Ward Churchill's essay. But anyway, I chose to just say, okay, let's just go with my gut. And so context taken into account, I don't believe that God exists. So my entity in my situation was not omniscient, omnipotent, did not create everybody, was just making everybody suffer eternally without any possibility for reprieve from that suffering. And of course, essentially what I did was paint a picture of hell without intending to. Now, there are some subtle differences, or maybe not so subtle. Of course, the entity in my scenario or person was only doing it for some sick, twisted pleasure. They weren't doing it for some sort of justice or anything like that. So there are, of course, differences. But I find it interesting to note that Negation of P's video was more of a snapshot of theology, and that would be the worst possible moral act. And I didn't really think of that, in my scenario, because I don't believe that God exists. So I was trying to think of the worst possible moral act given my current belief set. Now, of course, it only takes a brief thought experiment to go to the step that Negation of P took and apply that to theology. Now, obviously, there's going to be Christians who are going to object to his painting of that, but I mean, that's where the conversation comes in. That's where we can have the discussion. Okay, this wasn't done for any sick, twisted pleasure. It was done for a measure of justice. What does that justice actually represent? What is that justice? Is it truly objective, or is it just the will and wishes of the omniscient, omnipotent creator of all these people? And I can actually kind of see where you could even make the case that perhaps creating people at all, or any sentient beings with the capability of suffering, as being the worst moral act possible, sort of along the lines of what the ethelists would say. Now, I'm not an ethelist and I don't follow their line of reasoning, but I can understand it. And they do actually have some good points. I think that's the danger of just rejecting people's philosophies out of hand, because there's usually a grain of truth in just about everything. So if I think a little bit about, the creation of sentient life, I think for myself, what could be argued as a very horrible moral act would be to create beings, sentient beings with the capability of suffering, and then creating the very conditions in which they could be made to suffer eternally with no even way to just cease existing. That would be an absolutely, obviously, horrifyingly immoral act. Similarly, to create sentient beings with so-called free will and then to punish them for actualizing that free will. It's always been my argument that if there were a creator God, that their sovereignty ended the moment they created the first sentient life, because they bear a responsibility for suffering that never needed to exist. It would be better to not exist at all than to exist with any kind of eternal suffering, regardless of maybe 90 years of relative pleasure or whatever. So I think it's an interesting question. I chose not to qualify my video too much because that was sort of one of the things that Matthew Steele asked us not to do. So I'm doing all my qualifying here. I think at the end of the day, the worst moral act is not of that much utility to us, because per most of the examples, those of us around don't have the power capable of creating the worst possible moral act. So if you're going to talk about what is the worst moral act that an individual would be capable of, given the resources available to them, that's a different question. But even that doesn't provide us with a lot of utility, because I think we all recognize those things. To me, they're akin to the lifeboat scenarios that I kind of despise a little bit, that don't really have any real world traction for us. They don't provide us a lot of practical applications for applying secular ethics. But I do think it starts the conversation, and I think that's a good thing. I think on my channel, we were sort of talking about morality last year, maybe about this time, or maybe closer to the fall. And I think those things are all very interesting questions. So I do appreciate Matthew Steele bringing this topic up and asking for some responses, because it does make everybody think. And I'd like everyone out there to think a little bit about it. Let me know what you think in the comments section below. Thanks as always for watching.